I used to think that if I kept everything running smoothly, laundry folded, fridge stocked, Liam's toys lined up in the playroom, I could hold on to a place in this house, in this family. Brandon liked things neat. Jessica liked them quieter. I did my best to make sure they didn't have to ask twice. It's funny how easy it is to become invisible when you live to serve. The house sat on a quiet street in suburban Ohio, one of those neighborhoods where every lawn looked manicured enough to be staged. The kind of place where smiles happened over trimmed hedges and judgment brewed behind closed blinds. From the outside, it looked like we had it all. Me, my son Brandon, his wife Jessica, and their little boy Liam. A family nestled under one roof, a warm, functional unit, the American ideal. But inside that house, there was an edge to everything. Brandon liked control. It seeped into how he spoke, how he looked at you. Subtle, sharp. When I poured the milk wrong, he made a face. When I missed a spot vacuuming, his voice tightened. "How hard is it, Mom?" "You're here all day." Jessica never said much, just tightened her lips and avoided eye contact. She was always polite. Southern sweet, I used to call it. But it was the kind of polite that closed doors instead of opening them. They let me live there after Thomas died. My husband. It was supposed to be temporary until I got back on my feet. That was 6 years ago. At first, I cooked dinners, helped with the baby, took care of things. It felt good to be needed to stay busy. But somewhere along the line, it stopped being a gesture and became an expectation, an unspoken contract. I cleaned because no one else would. I babysat because I didn't have anywhere else to go. I didn't complain. I told myself it was enough. That love meant giving, that family meant sacrifice. Still, some nights I'd lie awake listening to the creak of the house and wonder, if I disappeared tomorrow, would they even notice? Liam was the light in that home, bright-eyed, always asking questions. "Why's the sky blue, Nana? Why do trees sleep in winter?" He didn't see the tension in the way his father's jaw clenched or the way Jessica's hands fidgeted when I spoke too long at dinner. He just saw me. His Nana, with the soft lap and warm cookies and stories from when his daddy was small. It was through Liam that I remembered pieces of myself. The woman I used to be. The one who painted on weekends, who had friends, who used to dream. Now, I scheduled my days around laundry loads and grocery runs. I wore soft-soled shoes so I wouldn't make noise past 9 p.m. I tried not to speak when Brandon was watching the news. I told myself I was lucky. After all, they hadn't asked me to leave. Not yet. But I saw the way Jessica's smile faltered when I walked into the room. I heard Brandon's sighs when I forgot the almond milk or used the wrong detergent. I felt the difference between being loved and being tolerated. It's a difference you learn when you grow up with it. My own mother used to say, "Don't expect too much from people, or you'll always end up disappointed." That kind of lesson seeps in early, shapes you. Sometimes I wondered if I'd pass that down to Brandon unintentionally. If maybe the coldness he gave me now was a mirror of what I'd once given him, out of ignorance or exhaustion. Generational damage, quietly handed down like heirlooms no one wanted. In the attic, locked in an old cedar chest, was a letter Thomas left me before he passed. I hadn't opened it. I told myself it was just his will, formalities and legalese, but something in me knew better. Knew it held truths I wasn't ready to face. Not yet. There was also something else I hadn't told anyone. Not Brandon, not Jessica, not even my best friend from the library, Marion, who I hadn't seen in months. Something Thomas had entrusted to me. Something I'd kept hidden all these years. I carried that secret like a stone in my chest. Heavy, constant, a reminder that I still had something of my own. Something untouched. But secrets, like wounds, don't stay buried forever. In the quiet before everything fell apart, I held on to routine like a lifeline. I made breakfast before anyone woke up. I folded Brandon's shirts the way he liked. I smiled at Jessica even when she didn't look at me. I laughed at Liam's jokes. I kept the machine running. Because I believed, foolishly maybe, that if I was useful, I'd be safe. But safety is an illusion, and illusions like glass shatter with the slightest pressure. The phone call came just after 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was dusting the bookshelf in the living room, my fingers tracing the spines of novels I hadn't had time to reread in years, when the librarian's voice broke through the receiver, strained, apologetic, distant. I knew before she finished speaking. We're cutting hours, permanently this time. I'm so sorry, Elaine. I thanked her, told her I understood. It wasn't personal, just numbers, just a budget. But when I hung up, my hands trembled. That job wasn't about money, it was about purpose. It was the last sliver of independence I had. 3 mornings a week shelving books, helping teenagers with research papers, chatting with the older patrons who came in more for company than novels. It made me feel like I still belonged somewhere outside these walls. I stared at the phone, waiting to feel something solid. Instead, there was just a hollowness, like the floor had shifted and I was the only one who noticed. I didn't tell Brandon right away. I told myself I needed time to process, but deep down, I knew what his reaction would be. He found out 2 days later. Jessica mentioned it at dinner casually, like she was asking about the weather. Brandon, did you know your mom's not working at the library anymore? I froze mid-bite. Jessica's tone was syrupy sweet, but her eyes were sharp. Brandon lowered his fork, looked at me like I'd dropped a glass on the carpet. You lost your job? It wasn't. I didn't lose it. They cut my hours permanently, I added, voice barely above a whisper. He pushed back his chair, that familiar flare in his eyes, cold, condescending. So you're not contributing at all now? I take care of Liam, I clean. That's not the same. That's not income. Jessica and I work our asses off to support this household, and you're just here. Jessica sipped her wine and said nothing. I looked at my plate, suddenly nauseous. I didn't ask for. You live here rent-free, Mom. The least you could do is not make us carry your weight. Each word hit harder than the last. He didn't even raise his voice. That's the thing about Brandon. His cruelty always came polished, packaged as logic, wrapped in false concern. Jessica leaned forward. Maybe it's time you considered other options, Elaine. Maybe a senior housing community, someplace where you can have your own space. My heart thudded in my chest, not because of the words, they were polite enough, but because I'd seen this coming. They were pushing me out. Brandon stood up. We'll talk about this tomorrow. I need to think. He walked out of the room. Jessica followed. I sat there staring at the half-eaten meatloaf on my plate, hearing the echo of a younger me, 30 years old, standing in my childhood kitchen, being told by my own mother that I was too emotional, too needy. I'd left that house thinking I'd never feel that small again. But here I was, 58 and invisible. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Thomas, the way he used to rub my back after a hard day, whisper, "You matter, Ellie. You're more than what they see." He always said that when Brandon was little, when I used to cry quietly after putting our son to bed, unsure how to be both mother and wife and human. At 3 a.m., I found myself in the attic. It was cold up there. Dust coated the boxes. My hands knew exactly where to go. Past the Christmas ornaments, the baby clothes I'd kept for reasons I couldn't explain. I pulled the cedar chest into the light. It still smelled faintly of pine and tobacco. I opened it. There, beneath the yellowed wedding album and Thomas's old fishing journal, was the envelope. Sealed. My name written on the front in his familiar script, Elaine. I sat cross-legged on the floor and stared at it, heart pounding. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter, 4 pages, and a key. If you're reading this, Ellie, it means things didn't go the way we hoped. I didn't tell you before because I knew you'd try to share it, try to be fair even when others weren't. But this is for you. The safety deposit box at Holman Savings, box number 512. The documents inside detail the trust I set up. It's not massive, but it's enough. Enough for you to breathe without asking permission. Enough for you to be free. I didn't cry. I couldn't. Instead, I sat there stunned. Thomas, quiet, steady Thomas, had left me a lifeline, a secret fortune he'd protected, knowing that someday I might need it. And he hadn't told Brandon, hadn't trusted him with it. I held the letter to my chest, the weight of it almost unbearable, not because of the money, but because it was the first time in years I felt seen. I left before sunrise. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match, no slammed doors. Just the quiet shuffle of slippers on tile, the muted zip of my suitcase, the soft click of the latch behind me. I took only what I needed: two changes of clothes, my medications, the photo of Thomas and me on our wedding day, and the letter. Everything else felt like it belonged to someone else's life now, not mine. The motel sat just off Highway 16 behind a gas station and a diner with flickering neon signs. It was the kind of place travelers stop for a night before moving on, never meant to hold the weight of anyone's entire world unraveling. But the clerk didn't ask questions and the room was clean. Beige walls, thin blankets, and the hum of an ancient mini fridge in the corner. It would do. The moment the door closed behind me, silence dropped like a curtain. A new kind of quiet. Not the silence of tension, like in Brandon's house. Not the silence of holding your breath around people who no longer see you. This was emptier, freer somehow, but terrifying. I sat on the edge of the bed and let my body feel what it had been holding back for weeks. No, years. My chest ached. Not physically, not exactly. It was more like an internal heaviness, an ache of having been dismissed one too many times, of fading out of my own story. I cried, not the elegant tears you see in movies. These were messy, raw sobs that shook my shoulders and blurred my vision. I cried for Thomas, for the way Brandon looked through me like I was furniture, for all the hours I spent trying to earn love that should have been unconditional. The next morning, I woke up disoriented. The motel light filtered through the cheap curtains, and for a second I thought I was back home. But then I saw my suitcase, still zipped. The air smelled of bleach and old carpet. I stayed in bed most of the day. I couldn't bring myself to turn on the TV. I just stared at the ceiling, memories playing like grainy home movies behind my eyes. Thomas used to call me his still water. He said I didn't rush, didn't need noise. He was the opposite, bigger than life, a loud laugh and warm arms that made everything feel okay. Even when things were hard, he made me believe they wouldn't always be. He had faith in people, even when they didn't deserve it. I remembered the early days of Brandon's childhood, Thomas teaching him to ride a bike, the way Brandon used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call them golden wishes. He used to cling to my hand in crowds, called me his safe place. When had that changed? Had I changed? Had I given too much? Or just not enough in the ways he needed? I'd spent decades folding my identity into the corners of other people's lives: mother, wife, caretaker. But rarely just Elaine. It had been so long since I asked myself what I wanted, I wasn't sure I'd recognize the answer if it appeared in bold print. I reached for Thomas's letter again, rereading the last line over and over. It's enough for you to be free. Free. The word echoed in my mind like a bell. Not just safe, not just secure, free. I pulled out a notepad from my bag and made a list. A real list. Not grocery items or chores, but questions. Who am I without them? What do I want now? Can I start over at 58? Will it be enough? I didn't have answers, but I had something else. The key. That key felt heavier than it should. Cold. Powerful. It was the kind of object that didn't just unlock a box, but a new life. A different self. I could drive to Holman Savings tomorrow. I could see what Thomas left behind. Maybe it was enough to rent an apartment. Take classes, buy books without checking the price tag. Maybe I could even find a part-time job again, someplace quiet where I could just be. The thought scared me, but it also lit something small inside me. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like a choice. It felt surreal, the way the bank doors opened like they had been waiting for me all along. Holman Savings was quiet on a Thursday morning, the receptionist polite but perfunctory as she led me to a small office tucked in the back. The manager, a lean man in his 60s named Harold Linwood, looked over the key and the envelope with a kind of reverence. "Let's see what we've got here," he said gently, as if unlocking something sacred. Inside the safety deposit box were 3 items: the trust documentation, a notarized letter from Thomas outlining his intentions, and a small navy blue ledger. The numbers in that ledger didn't look real. I blinked, then blinked again. There was over $700,000 in my name. All of it separate from Brandon, untraceable, protected. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Not because of the number itself, but because of what it meant. Proof that Thomas had seen this coming. That he'd known on some level what I might one day need. Not just security, but autonomy. I left the bank with a stack of folders in my purse and a strange, weightless feeling in my chest. I wasn't sure if it was relief or grief. Maybe both. The next few weeks unfolded like waking up from a long, colorless dream. I met with a financial advisor, a no-nonsense woman named Candace, who looked me in the eye and said, "You have options, real ones." It was the first time in years someone had spoken to me like that, with respect, like I mattered. I bought a modest two-bedroom cottage in Marigold Hills, a quiet town 20 miles east. The kind of place where neighbors waved from porches and everyone knew the name of the local baker. The house had ivy on the brick and a chipped porch swing that groaned when I sat on it, but it was mine. Every creaking floorboard, every light switch. It wasn't just about owning property, it was about claiming space. I enrolled in continuing education courses at the community college. Writing, art history, beginner's acrylic painting. It felt indulgent at first, but then liberating. I sat among 20-year-olds and retirees, trading thoughts on Georgia O'Keeffe and Sylvia Plath, feeling something long dormant stretch and breathe. I painted clumsy still lifes and wrote journal entries that turned into essays. One night I wrote a short story about a woman who disappears from her family and reappears as a lighthouse keeper in Maine. I read it aloud in class. People clapped. It wasn't about talent. It was about presence. In Marigold Hills, people called me Elaine. Not Mom, not Nana, just Elaine. I made friends, real ones. Doris, who taught ceramics and insisted on bringing me lavender tea every Wednesday. Nate, a widower who ran the used bookstore and had a sarcastic streak that reminded me of Thomas. Our conversations were slow and intentional, about books, life, grief, the strange ways we start over. There were still moments I missed Liam so much it hurt. I kept a small picture of him on the mantel. I didn't try to contact Brandon. I wasn't ready. Maybe I never would be. Some wounds don't heal when the person who caused them refuses to see them as wounds at all. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel ashamed of my silence. I didn't feel like I was hiding. I felt like I was reclaiming. Then came the call from Marion, my old friend from the library. She sounded hesitant at first. "Elaine, I wasn't sure if I should reach out. There's been talk." My stomach turned. What kind of talk? "Brandon's been telling people you had a breakdown, that you left in the middle of the night, left them with no notice, no explanation, that you were unstable." My mouth went dry. "He said you were reckless, that you've been having issues for a while, emotional ones." I didn't speak. Couldn't. Marion's voice softened. "I didn't believe it, but others, well, some people are starting to wonder." I hung up the phone and sat on the kitchen floor for over an hour, knees to my chest, staring at the baseboard. That familiar helplessness rose up again. The ache of being misunderstood, mischaracterized, gaslighted. Brandon hadn't just erased me from his life. He'd rewritten me, but this time, something was different. I didn't crumble. Instead, I stood up. I opened my laptop and I began to write. I titled the first post, "A Mother's Quiet Exit." Just those words, no preface, no explanation. I hadn't planned to write publicly. At first, the idea felt indulgent. Who would care about an aging woman's estrangement from her grown son? But after Marion's phone call, the silence around me felt too familiar. Too much like the old Elaine who swallowed pain until it turned to guilt. Brandon had always controlled the narrative. In school, if he lashed out at a teacher, I defended him before I asked what happened. As a teenager, when he flunked classes and blamed stress, I made excuses. As a man, he rewrote history with a calm face and confident voice, and I let him. But not this time. The blog was simple, a free template, no frills. I wrote in my own name, no aliases, no dramatics. "I didn't leave because I was unstable," I wrote. "I left because I was unwanted, and for the first time in my life, I chose to honor that pain instead of hide it." The words flowed more easily than I expected. Each post became a confession and a reclamation, a timeline of quiet wounds. I wrote about the day I lost my job, about the dinner table silence, about Jessica's soft cruelty wrapped in polite phrases. I wrote about the attic, the letter, the key, and the money. I wrote about sitting on a motel bed wondering if I was worth rebuilding. I didn't demonize Brandon. I didn't have to. The truth spoke loud enough. At first, I expected no one to read it, but 3 days after my first post, the comments started trickling in. This feels like my story. You're not alone. I left too. Thank you for saying what I've never had the courage to. Women from across the country shared their experiences. Daughters pushed out of their homes, mothers erased by adult children, caregivers who gave everything only to be called burdens. It stunned me. This secret sisterhood of women who'd kept quiet for decades, believing it was better not to make waves, better to bear the discomfort than confront it. I realized how many of us had been taught to equate love with sacrifice, silence with virtue. The blog grew. Marion sent the link to others. A local women's advocacy group reposted it. Then a podcast about family estrangement asked to interview me. I declined. I wasn't ready to speak into a microphone. But I wrote. Each entry became bolder, sharper, less afraid. Then Brandon called. I let it go to voicemail. His message was short, cold. I saw what you wrote. You're making me look like some kind of monster. You need to stop this before it gets worse. There was no apology, no curiosity, just control, still trying to frame the terms. The next day, a mutual acquaintance from church emailed me. Brandon says you're confused, that you've always had episodes. He's concerned for your mental health. It should have gutted me. A year ago it would have, but now? It only confirmed what I already knew. People who are afraid of the truth will always label it as madness. Instead of replying, I published another post. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. I wrote about gaslighting, about how easy it is to make someone feel like they're imagining cruelty when that cruelty is veiled in civility. I wrote about the exhaustion of constantly justifying your own pain. The support was overwhelming. One woman wrote, "Reading this was like breathing air I didn't know I was missing." Another, "Your story gave me the courage to leave a toxic home." Some days, I'd sit at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and read the comments for hours. They weren't just responses, they were lifelines, proof that I wasn't invisible, that what I'd endured mattered. I began to feel something I hadn't in years, power, not in the loud, aggressive sense, but in the quiet, rooted kind, the kind that comes from owning your story, even the parts soaked in shame. Still, there were nights I questioned myself. I missed Liam. Missed the way he used to wrap his arms around my neck, his giggles when I read stories in silly voices. I worried about how much of Brandon's version he'd absorb. I worried about what he'd believe when he was old enough to Google my name. But those thoughts didn't paralyze me like they used to. They passed like clouds instead of storms. One afternoon, I walked past a mirror in the hallway and caught my reflection. For the first time in ages, I didn't look sad. I looked real, whole. Not because I had answers, but because I'd stopped pretending. The article appeared in the Marigold Daily Ledger on a rainy Monday morning, tucked between a city council update and a human interest piece about a rescued barn owl. The headline read, "Former librarian's blog on family estrangement strikes a national chord." I didn't expect it to matter. Small-town paper, limited readership. But by the afternoon, the article had made its way onto social media, shared by readers who saw themselves in my words. I watched the visitor count on my blog double, then triple. My inbox swelled with messages, some from strangers, others from people I hadn't heard from in years. Old library patrons, former neighbors, even my college roommate. But one message stood out, a name I didn't expect. Jessica Whitaker. The subject line was plain. "Can we talk?" I stared at it for minutes before clicking. The email was short, careful, no blame, no excuses. "Elaine, I've been reading your blog. I think I need to understand your side better. I'm sorry it took me so long to reach out." There was no mention of Brandon, no defense of what happened. Just a quiet request. I agreed to meet her at a cafe halfway between Marigold Hills and their town, neutral ground. She arrived in a navy coat, her hair pulled back, face drawn but open. We hugged awkwardly, the kind of hug you give someone you're not sure you're allowed to miss. Jessica sat across from me, fingers wrapped around a coffee mug she barely sipped. I didn't know, she said after a long silence. Not all of it. I knew Brandon could be sharp, but I thought you were okay with everything. You never said anything. I gave a soft laugh, not unkind, just honest. I stopped saying things when it became clear no one was listening. She looked away, ashamed. I'm sorry, I think I wanted to believe his version because it was easier than facing the truth about how we treated you. I nodded. I get it. It's easier to label someone broken than to admit you broke them. Tears welled in her eyes. Do you think we could fix it? I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew this moment mattered, that my answer would set the tone for everything that followed. I'm open to something new, I said slowly, but not a return. I can't go back to being the version of myself that fit into your house. That woman's gone. Jessica nodded, eyes glistening. That's fair. We talked for another hour, about Liam, about life, about the quiet grief of hurting someone and realizing too late. It didn't erase what had happened, but it opened a window. After we parted, I felt lighter, but not unguarded. I'd learned too much to hand over trust like a trinket. Boundaries were not walls. They were doors with locks I now held the keys to. That evening, I wrote a blog post titled, When Sorry Comes Too Late. I didn't name Jessica, but I captured the essence of the conversation, the way truth softens when it's finally spoken, how apology isn't a cure but a beginning. The post went viral. Readers resonated with the messiness of it, the in-between, the space where healing starts, not with forgiveness but with recognition. Then a week later, another email came, this time from a mutual friend, Anna, who still attended the same church as Brandon and Jessica. Her tone was different, urgent. I think you should know, Brandon's been struggling financially. There's talk that the house might go into foreclosure. Jessica hasn't confirmed anything, but she looks worn down. Quiet. Thought you'd want to know. I stared at the screen, the air thick around me. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated. Another part felt hollow. I hadn't wished him harm. I never would. But there was something brutal about watching karma arrive in plain clothes. Later that night, I went for a walk around the lake. The wind was cool, sharp against my cheeks. I thought about the letter Thomas had left, the money, the chance to start over, and I thought about Brandon, his pride, his silence, the way he'd never asked why I left, only how I dared. The truth had set me free, but it had also exposed him. And now I had a choice, to reach out or to stay still. I wasn't ready to decide, not yet. But I knew one thing for certain. I would never again let someone else's version of me be the only one that survived. He showed up on a Tuesday. No call, no warning, just the knock. Firm, familiar, and soaked in pride-swallowing discomfort. I opened the door and found Brandon standing there, thinner than I remembered, his expression weathered by something more than time. He didn't say hello, just cleared his throat and looked past me into the house. Can I come in? I let him. He sat stiffly on the edge of the armchair like a guest who expected to be turned away. I sat across from him, quiet, waiting. He avoided my eyes. I wouldn't be here if I had other options, he began, but yes, we're in trouble. I said nothing, let him struggle with the silence. He always hated silence unless he controlled it. He exhaled. The house. We're behind on the mortgage. 2 months, maybe 3. Jessica didn't want me to come. She thinks it's too late, but I don't know. I thought maybe you'd consider helping. Just a loan. I'll pay you back. He finally looked at me, and for a flicker of a second, I saw my little boy in his eyes, the one who used to scrape his knees and ask me to make it stop hurting. I took a slow breath. You came for money. He nodded once, tightly. Not apology, not understanding. Just desperation wrapped in pride. Everything in me bristled, not because of the request, but because of what wasn't there. No, I'm sorry. No, how have you been? Just a transaction. Still, I didn't throw him out. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind turned over every angle like stones in my hands. Part of me ached for him. He was still my son, and yet another part screamed with caution. I'd spent decades bending until I broke, and I had only recently begun to stand up straight again. I took the dilemma to my therapist, Dr. Marla Jameson, a woman who didn't sugarcoat anything. Helping isn't wrong, she said after I laid it all out. But doing it without protecting yourself, that's just reenacting the old dynamic in a new costume. I also brought it up with my support group. One woman, Alice, said, "You can love someone and still not trust them with your healing." Those words stuck. I gave myself 2 days. No impulsive responses. I walked, painted, journaled, then I sat down and wrote Brandon a letter. Typed, deliberate, clear. "Brandon, I've thought carefully about your request. I'm willing to help, but with conditions. This will be a structured loan, drawn up with legal documentation. You will attend financial counseling with Jessica and provide a written plan. We will meet monthly for accountability check-ins. If these terms are too much, I understand, but they are non-negotiable. This is not a punishment, it's a protection for both of us." "Oh, Mom." He responded the next day through email, short and terse, but agreeing to the terms. No thank you, no warmth, just compliance. It stung, but I'd stopped expecting softness from him. What mattered was that, for the first time, I wasn't abandoning myself to care for him. We met the following week at a lawyer's office. He signed the documents with the same clenched jaw he used to hold when told no as a boy. The money would be transferred directly to the mortgage company. No middlemen, no blurred lines. As we left the office, he hesitated at the door. "I know you think I'm the villain." I looked at him, older now, worn down, still unable to name the things he'd done. "I think you're lost," I said, "but that's not my job to fix anymore." He gave a stiff nod, walked away, and yet something had shifted. Not much, but enough to leave the door cracked. Helping him didn't erase the past. It didn't undo the hurt, but it also didn't undo me. And that, I realized, was what growth looked like. Not in grand gestures, but in quiet decisions that honored your healing while still offering grace. It started with a single suggestion from Dr. Jameson during one of my sessions. "Would you consider family therapy? Not for resolution, but for understanding?" The question lingered with me for days. I wasn't sure what Brandon or Jessica would say, or if I even wanted to open that door again. But something about it tugged at me, not out of longing, but out of curiosity. Had they changed? Could they? To my surprise, when I brought it up, delicately over email, Jessica responded almost immediately. "I think it's worth trying." Brandon's reply was shorter. "If it helps clarify things, I'm in." It didn't sound like a peace offering, more like a reluctant truce. Still, it was something. We met every Tuesday at a neutral office in a converted brownstone. The therapist, Dr. Colleen Farrow, was gentle but incisive, a woman who didn't let silence go unexamined. The first session was awkward. We sat like strangers around a coffee table, the air thick with years of unspoken grievances. "I think we need to begin," Dr. Farrow said, "by acknowledging not what's been said, but what hasn't." I spoke first, slowly, cautiously. I talked about the way the house had felt in those final years, how invisible I felt, how unwelcomed. Brandon was stiff at first, defensive. "You never told us, you just left." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't just leave, I was pushed. Jessica looked down at her hands, silent. Over time, the sessions deepened. Dr. Farrow pulled threads I hadn't realized were connected. How Brandon's need for control mirrored Thomas's quiet stoicism. How my tendency to disappear emotionally mirrored my own mother's. Patterns, generational echoes. One session, Brandon broke. "I was scared," he admitted. "When Dad died, I felt like I had to hold everything together. Provide, manage, fix. When you stopped working, I felt like I was failing, like everything was slipping." Jessica reached for his hand. "You didn't have to carry it alone." "I didn't know how not to," he whispered. We sat in silence then, the kind that didn't choke, but opened. Jessica spoke about feeling caught in the middle, about her own mother's sharp words and the way she'd learned to stay silent to survive. I thought I was being respectful, she said, tears in her eyes, but I was complicit. Each session peeled back another layer. We didn't resolve everything. Some wounds were too deep, some habits too ingrained, but we began to see one another not as roles, but as people. Flawed, scared, trying. For the first time, Brandon apologized. "I'm sorry for making you feel like a burden. I thought I was protecting my family. I didn't see that I was erasing you." It wasn't perfect, but it was real. I began to speak more freely, not with anger, but with clarity. I told them about the motel room, the fear, the liberation, about the blog, the letters from strangers, the strength I'd found in sharing the parts of my life I'd been told weren't worth speaking aloud. Jessica cried. Brandon listened, really listened. And then, a week after one particularly raw session, an email arrived that I almost deleted as spam. Subject line: Memoir proposal inquiry, interested publisher. It was from an acquisitions editor at Hazelwood Press, a boutique publishing house known for memoirs that challenge norms. She'd been following my blog, thought there was a story there, asked if I had ever considered expanding it into a book. My hands trembled as I read it. Not out of fear, out of something deeper. Validation. I brought it up in therapy. "I'm scared," I admitted, "of what it might expose, of how it might affect them." Dr. Farrow asked, "What's more important, protecting the comfort of your past or honoring the truth of your journey?" I already knew the answer. Brandon and Jessica were quiet when I told them. Then Brandon surprised me. "If it helps other people, then maybe it's worth it." Jessica added, "It's your story, Elaine. You should own it." I didn't cry then. I waited until later when I was alone, not because I was sad, but because this time they saw me, not as a mother, not as a burden, but as a woman with a voice. And I wasn't going to waste it. The first time I walked into the Hazelwood Press office, I wore my favorite navy cardigan and the gold locket Thomas gave me on our 5th anniversary. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I just wanted to feel like myself. The editors greeted me warmly, with the kind of familiarity that comes from having read the rawest parts of someone's life. "We don't want to change your voice," said Naomi, the lead editor. "We want to help you tell the full story, with shape, with clarity, with strength." The process was rigorous. Months of outlining, rewriting, filling in the silences between blog entries. Naomi pushed me gently but firmly. "What were you feeling in this moment?" she'd ask. "What didn't you say?" At first, it felt like peeling back old wounds, but soon it became cathartic, like building a house from the ruins of something that once buried me. We chose a title together, Still Standing, A Mother's Journey Through Silence and Survival. It didn't feel like revenge, it felt like reclamation. When the book was ready, Hazelwood scheduled a series of readings and interviews, small indie bookstores, library panels, podcasts. I was terrified at first. Public speaking had never been my strong suit. But the first time I stood before an audience and read the opening pages, something shifted. They listened, really listened, not out of politeness, but recognition. In the front row, I saw a woman my age silently crying, nodding at every sentence. After the reading, she waited in line just to touch my hand. "You wrote my life," she whispered. "You gave it words." At each event, people came forward. Older women, young mothers, adult children estranged from parents, survivors of emotional abuse who never had the vocabulary to define what they endured. They didn't want advice. They wanted connection. And I gave it, not as an expert, but as someone who had been lost and found herself on the other side of grief. My inbox overflowed again, but this time, the messages weren't just about shared pain. They were about change. Women leaving toxic homes, men apologizing to mothers they hadn't understood, daughters speaking truths that had lived in their throats for years. I began writing weekly essays for Hazelwood's online platform, pieces on aging with agency, navigating estrangement, the myth of the selfless mother. Each post felt like planting a flag in once forbidden territory. Back home, my life found a new rhythm. Mornings with tea and emails from readers, afternoons editing chapters or preparing talks, and evenings, quiet, full, mine. The cottage no longer felt like a hiding place. It was a headquarters, a haven, a home. One Sunday, I hosted a small garden party to celebrate the book's release. Jessica brought lemon tarts. Brandon arrived late, holding a bottle of wine and looking sheepish. He hugged me, brief but real. "I read it," he said, "the book." I braced for criticism, but he only added, "It was hard, but important." Later, while I was showing guests around the garden, I overheard him telling someone, "She's doing something that matters." I'm proud of her. It was the first time I'd heard those words from his mouth. They didn't erase the past, but they honored the present. Jessica, too, had softened. She emailed often, asking for parenting advice, sending pictures of Liam. She even arranged for him to visit me one weekend. We painted birdhouses together, made pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. He didn't ask why I had left. He just held my hand like he used to, and that was enough. Some days I still grieved. Healing didn't mean forgetting, but now grief lived beside joy, not in place of it. I had become something I never thought I'd be again. Whole. And that wholeness, messy, fragile, resilient, had become a light for others, too. The foundation began with a name scrawled at the top of a yellow legal pad, the Whitaker Trust Project. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the act of giving shape to something that had once nearly broken me, turning private pain into a public resource. I wanted to create a space for people who had nowhere to go when their families closed their doors, or worse, stayed open but loveless. With Naomi's help from Hazelwood and a small team of volunteers, we launched the foundation 6 months after my book's release. The mission was simple: offer resources, support groups, and financial aid to those navigating familial estrangement and emotional abuse, especially mothers and older adults displaced by toxic dynamics. Our first workshop filled within a week. We hosted it in the community center downtown, in a room with folding chairs and chipped paint. But when we sat in that circle telling truths, no one noticed the walls. I shared my story again, this time not for validation, but for invitation, to say, "You are not alone, you are not crazy, you are not unworthy." After that, the stories poured in. Women in their 60s, even 80s, who'd been told they were too sensitive, too difficult, too much. People who'd lived entire lives trying to earn conditional love. Now they were speaking up and finding power in the telling. Brandon surprised me by asking to volunteer. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure if his presence would comfort or harm those who came for sanctuary. But he said, "I want to learn how to do better, not just with you, with Liam, with myself." He helped with logistics, stayed quiet during group sessions, asked questions afterward instead of offering answers. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was humility, and that mattered more. We even co-hosted a workshop titled Healing from Within: Family as Both Wound and Possibility. I watched him speak, candid and unsure, admitting to patterns he hadn't seen before. When one participant asked how a child could repair a relationship with a parent they'd hurt, Brandon didn't look at me. He looked inward. "I think it starts with believing them," he said, "even when it's hard." Jessica brought Liam to some of the foundation's community events. He handed out name tags and helped serve cookies. Once he asked, "Nana, what does your foundation do?" I knelt beside him. "We help people who've been hurt by people they love." He thought about that for a second. Like when someone says mean things but still wants to hug you? "Exactly," I said, holding back tears. "We teach them how to protect their hearts." He nodded solemnly, like it made sense in a way grown-ups often miss. Watching Liam grow up in this new version of our family, one where emotions were acknowledged instead of shamed, was its own kind of healing. He asked questions. He hugged without fear. He apologized without being prompted. He listened. And in that, I saw the future bending. One afternoon, while sorting through old mail I'd neglected for months, I found an envelope with a return address I didn't recognize. The handwriting was neat, unmistakable. Carolyn, my sister. We hadn't spoken in over 20 years, not since the bitter argument after our father's funeral. Words sharp enough to end something once sacred. I'd always assumed the silence was mutual, permanent. I opened the letter with shaking hands. "Elaine, I've been following your work. Your book reached me in ways I can't fully explain. I didn't know how much pain you carried. I didn't know how much of it I mirrored. If you're open to it, I'd like to talk. Not to explain, not to defend, just to see if there's something still here worth salvaging. Carolyn. I sat with the letter for hours, rereading each word until the ink felt etched into me. It didn't feel like a door flung open, but a window cracked just enough to let in air. I didn't know if I'd respond, but I knew one thing. Healing, like truth, was a process, and this time I had the tools and the boundaries to choose wisely. As the sun dipped behind the trees that lined my backyard, I looked out at the small garden Liam had helped me plant in the spring. Daisies, tulips, and something wild that bloomed without a name. I thought of all the women who'd sat in those foundation circles, of Brandon fumbling his way through accountability, of Liam learning to love without shame, of Thomas, who left me a key and in doing so, gave me the permission to turn a closed door into a beginning. And I realized this was the legacy, not survival, but transformation. We met at a small cafe on the edge of Marigold Hills, the kind of place with chipped mugs, warm pie, and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because I needed a moment to breathe before seeing her again. Carolyn, my sister, my first friend, my oldest wound. When she walked in, time collapsed. She looked older, yes. Her hair more silver than blonde, lines deeper around her eyes, but she still wore that same serious expression that used to make people think she was unkind. She wasn't, just guarded. We hugged awkwardly at first, then tighter, not to erase the past, just to acknowledge the years we'd both survived. We sat and talked for hours about Dad, about the fight, about the silence that followed, about what we thought we knew about each other and how wrong we'd been. "I thought you judged me," I said. "I thought you didn't need me," she whispered back. We laughed at how stubborn we'd both been, how pride kept us in separate corners of grief, both waiting for the other to reach out. And then we cried. Not from regret, but release. As if the weight we'd carried was finally set down between us. By the end of lunch, we'd made plans for her to visit my home and meet the rest of my family. 2 weeks later, I hosted a garden gathering, an informal celebration of growth and reconnection. Brandon brought Liam, who immediately took to Carolyn, asking if she liked dinosaurs and if she knew how to whistle. Jessica came too, with a warm smile and lemon tarts, just like last time. Carolyn brought photo albums, ones I hadn't seen in decades. We passed them around the patio, flipping through images of birthday parties and beach trips, our mother's disapproving frown in the background of almost every shot. Brandon saw pictures of me at 17, smiling with a confidence I hadn't remembered until I saw it captured. "That's you?" he said, a little stunned. "That was me before the world asked me to shrink," I answered. He didn't reply. He just looked at me longer than usual, not searching, for once, but seeing. Later that week, the Marigold Hills Community Association held a small award ceremony at the library. They honored volunteers, educators, and a few local advocates. When they called my name, Elaine Whitaker, for her work supporting emotional abuse survivors and her contributions to intergenerational healing. The applause felt surreal. I stood behind the podium, looked at the rows of chairs filled with faces I'd come to know, neighbors, workshop attendees, classmates, friends, and for the first time in my life, I didn't minimize my impact. "I used to believe my story didn't matter unless someone else approved it," I told them. "But I've learned that truth doesn't need permission. It just needs space." Afterward, a woman approached me in tears. "Your book saved me," she said. "I didn't even know what I was living through until I read your words." That book had been only the beginning. I'd just finished my second. It was called Rooted, A Journey Through Forgiveness and Family. Not as raw as the first, but deeper in a different way. Where the first book exhaled pain, this one breathed reconciliation. It explored how forgiveness wasn't always about excusing harm, but about freeing yourself from it, about choosing peace even when anger felt justified. Naomi said it was the best thing I'd written. Brandon said he wanted a signed copy. One evening I sat on my porch with Carolyn. The sky was painted with that late summer lavender, and cicadas buzzed in the distance. "You know," she said, "I used to envy you." I looked at her, surprised. You always found ways to carry other people's pain. I never learned how to hold my own. I smiled. Maybe we're both learning now. She nodded, and for a moment we just sat in silence, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. That night, I wrote in my journal, "This is what healing looks like. Not perfect, not linear, but alive, messy and miraculous." The mornings were hers now. She woke without alarm clocks, without the anxious shuffle of trying to stay ahead of someone else's schedule. The cottage filled with the slow hush of the world waking up, birds in the hedges, the kettle's low whistle, sunlight spilling across the hardwood floors like a benediction. Elaine moved through her days with purpose, but never urgency. Mondays were for writing, essays, journal entries, notes for a third book she hadn't yet told anyone about. Tuesdays and Thursdays, she volunteered at the Foundation's new downtown office, where a growing team now offered peer support groups and trauma-informed workshops. She'd become a mentor to dozens of women, many older, some startlingly young. They brought her handwritten poems, tentative first drafts of memoirs, grief in every shape imaginable. And Elaine listened, not with answers, but with presence. She'd learned that healing wasn't about fixing. It was about witnessing. Afternoons often belonged to Liam. On Fridays, Jessica would drop him off with a backpack full of snacks and comic books. They'd build pillow forts, walk to the farmer's market, or paint in the sunroom. He'd begun asking more questions lately about emotions, about the past, about what it meant to listen with your heart. Brandon came by occasionally too, not out of obligation anymore, but with quiet intent. He'd linger after picking Liam up, asking about foundation updates or bringing over something he'd read that reminded him of one of her essays. They didn't dwell on the past, but they didn't pretend it hadn't happened either. There was respect now, not the kind that required silence, but the kind built on effort. Elaine's days were full in a way she hadn't thought possible. Evenings were slow. Books, candles, sometimes a phone call from Carolyn, who now lived an hour away and visited often. Their bond, once frayed to the edge of nothing, had turned into something textured and strong, not perfect, but honest. The foundation had begun receiving grants. They expanded programming, launched an annual storytelling retreat, and Elaine was invited to speak at national conferences. One journalist called her a voice for the voiceless, though Elaine often laughed at that. "They've always had voices," she would say. "They just needed someone to believe them." Her name became synonymous with resilience in Marigold Hills. The local high school added her first memoir to their senior reading list. A mural was painted downtown, bright strokes of lavender and navy with the words, "Healing is the bravest kind of survival." Still, the greatest change wasn't public. It was internal. She no longer needed anyone's permission to take up space. She no longer questioned her worth when someone turned cold. She no longer mistook silence for safety. What began as exile had turned into liberation. What once felt like abandonment had revealed itself as a return to self. One Saturday evening, on the anniversary of her blog's first post, Elaine hosted a dinner under the string lights in her backyard. Long tables stretched across the lawn. Brandon carved the roast. Jessica passed around salad. Carolyn brought out old family photos. Liam performed a skit he'd written himself, wearing a paper crown and ending with a dramatic bow. Friends from the foundation mingled with neighbors, students, and strangers who had once been broken, but now stood tall. Laughter rose into the trees like smoke from a fire. Elaine sat at the head of the table, wine glass in hand, watching it all, not with pride, but with peace. She leaned toward Brandon. "Remember when I thought I was just the help in your house?" He flinched slightly, then smiled. "I remember, and I'm sorry I didn't see more." "You do now," she said gently. He nodded. "Thanks for not giving up on me." "I didn't do it for you," she replied. "I did it for me. That's how this started. But I'm glad you came along." As the night wore on, the conversation softened. Candles flickered, plates emptied. And Elaine looked out at this unlikely tapestry of people and paths and pain and healing, all woven into something beautiful. She thought of Thomas, of the key, of the motel room, of that first post. She thought of the silence that once defined her life and how she'd turned it into story. And as the moon rose above the hedges, Elaine felt something land inside her, settled, full, unwavering. This, she realized, was belonging. Not in a place, not in a role, but in herself. If Elaine's story resonated with you, if you've ever felt erased, unheard, or forced to shrink in spaces that should have held you, know this: your voice matters, your truth is valid, and your healing doesn't need permission. Share this story, comment your reflections, and let others know they're not alone. Because sometimes the act of listening can be the first step toward someone else's freedom. What would your first chapter sound like? Tell us below.